drawing to a close. Why there are signs the impeachment trial of President Donald Trump is winding down. Under quarantine, the death toll continues to rise from the coronavirus in China. How the government is responding. On the way out, we have analysis of Britain's exit from the European Union. And an upright citizen, a look back at the Catholic faith of a player who will appear in the Super Bowl on Sunday. On EWTN News Nightly for Friday, January 31st, 2020. Good evening and thanks for joining us tonight. I'm Tracy Sable. President Donald Trump appeared headed for an all but certain acquittal in his impeachment trial. Republican senators prepared today to reject efforts to call more witnesses. And although the timing of a final vote is still uncertain, they are moving closer to wrapping up the impeachment trial. Catholic news agency's Matt Hadra reports now from Capitol Hill.
Senator Lamar Alexander of Tennessee says he will not vote in favor of impeachment witnesses. That essentially ends any Democratic hopes of gathering enough Republican support to force the issue. Democrats are rankling, though, at the idea of the trial ending here. Republican Senator Lamar Alexander says he believes the evidence against the president does not amount to an impeachable offense. Democrats blame him for saying he does not need to hear from new witnesses.
Lamar's decision, it's an offense against the Senate, it's an offense against the rule of law, and it's an offense against the American people. The American people will never know the true facts. The Senate will now have the first ever so-called trial that is a kangaroo court without witnesses and without documents.
If my Republican colleagues refuse to consider witnesses and documents in this trial, the president's acquittal will be meaningless because it will be the result of a sham trial. If there are no witnesses, no documents in this trial, there will be a permanent asterisk next to the acquittal of President Trump.
Every American knows that if you have a trial without relevant witnesses and documents, that it's a sham. And there is no vindication in a fraudulent trial.
Republican leaders strongly disagree an acquittal would lack legitimacy.
Obviously, our Democratic colleagues are going to vote party line, but we have some very independent thinkers in the Republican caucus, and I think Senator Alexander's statement was a principled one.
4 Democratic presidential candidates are among the jurors voting on impeachment. They face off against each other in the Iowa caucuses on Monday. Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska has also said that she will not vote in favor of more witnesses. Some Republicans hinted earlier today that it is possible the conclusion of the trial will not come until after Tuesday evening when President Trump delivers his State of the Union address. At the Capitol, Matt Hadro, EWTN News Nightly.
Democrats' efforts to call witnesses like John Bolton, the former national security advisor, seem to have fallen short. The president is still responding to the latest claim from Bolton. White House correspondent Mark Irons reports now. Mark?
Tracy, the New York Times reports the president ordered John Bolton to broker a meeting between Rudy Giuliani and the president of Ukraine. The claim comes from the former national security advisor's forthcoming book. The president denied the account in a statement first reported by the Times. I never instructed John Bolton to set up a meeting for Rudy Giuliani, one of the greatest corruption fighters in America and by far the greatest mayor in the history of NYC, to meet with President Zelensky. That meeting never happened. Since it appears senators won't call witnesses in the Senate trial, hearing from Bolton is out of the question. It brings President Trump closer to wrapping up this chapter of his presidency.
This is a happy period for us. It's a happy period because we call this impeachment light.
Even if senators acquit the president, the House's impeachment leaves a historic blemish on his record, something that baffles the president. He spoke to supporters last night in Iowa.
You know, we're having probably the best years that we've ever had in the history of our country. And I just got impeached. Can you believe these people?
The president will face the House Democrats who impeached him when he gives the State of the Union address Tuesday night. And the president isn't letting it go.
Congressional Democrats are consumed with partisan rage and obsessed with a deranged witch hunt hoax.
The White House also held a briefing today to preview the president's State of the Union address. A senior administration official says it will focus on the, quote, great American comeback and feature themes like school choice and paid family leave. Tracy.
White House correspondent Mark Irons. Thank you, Mark. President Trump wants to put an end to human trafficking, and today he announced more resources to fight what he calls modern-day slavery.
We will not rest until we've stopped every last human trafficker and liberated every last survivor.
The president says there are over 23,000 human trafficking victims in the United States, and most of them are women. He signed an executive order today to create a new position in the Domestic Policy Council that will focus on this issue, and he ordered government departments to work together to prosecute offenders, assist victims, and promote prevention. The United States says Iran continues to violate the international nuclear deal and is now slapping new sanctions on the head of Iran's nuclear agency.
The Atomic Energy Organization of Iran has played a big role in Iran breaching its key nuclear commitments. It has exceeded the limits on its uranium stockpile and enrichment levels. The head of AEOI personally inaugurated the installation of new advanced centrifuges.
Even though the U.S. is sanctioning the head of Iran's nuclear agency, the State Department also announced that it's renewing waivers on sanctions that allow Russian, European, and Chinese companies to continue working with Iran's civil nuclear facilities. The U.S. Secretary of State is in Ukraine. Mike Pompeo says the country's president will be invited to meet President Trump at the White House, but only at the right time.
We'll find the appropriate opportunity. We want to make sure that it happens at a time when there are substantial progress, things that we can deliver between the two of us.
Secretary of State Pompeo met with Ukraine's foreign minister along with the leader of Ukraine's Orthodox Christians. While in Kiev, Pompeo visited a memorial to soldiers who died in the fighting against Russian-backed militias in eastern Ukraine. As the number of coronavirus cases around the world continues to rise, the United States has now declared the virus a public health emergency. Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar also announced that President Trump will temporarily bar entry to the U.S. of foreign nationals believed to be a risk of transmitting the virus. The new restrictions begin Sunday afternoon. The death toll has climbed to more than 200 people. Nearly 10,000 others have been infected. Tens of millions of people are under virtual quarantine, turning once bustling cities into ghost towns. The United States is advising against all travel to China. Delta Airlines and American Airlines have suspended all of their flights between the U.S. and China. Starting tomorrow, China will enforce new restrictions on religious groups in that country. The new administrative measures govern all aspects of religious life. Everything from formation to gatherings to yearly and daily projects will be subject to approval by the government's Religious Affairs Department. Joining me now by Skype to talk more about these restrictions and their implications is Dr. Thomas Farr. He is president of the Religious Freedom Institute. Dr. Farr, thanks so much for speaking with us.
Happy to be with you.
Dr. Farr, these measures that were put into place complete the so-called regulations on religious affairs that went into effect 2 years ago. How have these guidelines intensified religious persecution in China?
Well, as you say, they're going into effect tomorrow, but this has been burgeoning for a while. What it in effect means is that all of China's religious minority groups are going to be absorbed into the Chinese state and into the Communist Party. This is a policy that has developed over several decades, but it's this president, Xi Jinping, who in a speech in 2016 said we're going to adopt a policy of the Sinicization of religion. And it's pretty draconian. We've seen bad stuff in China in the Cultural Revolution and a lot of crackdowns and problems since then. But this is a new level. And others have called it a new cultural revolution. I agree with.
I know the measures state that religious organizations must spread the principles and policies of Chinese Communist Party. How significant of an impact will that have on Christianity?
Well, it'll have already having an enormous impact. And tomorrow, these regulations go into official effect. But what we're seeing is that the underground churches, which have existed really for decades, they're seriously acting to blot these out and forcing priests and pastors to go into the respective official so-called Chinese Catholic Patriotic Association for the Catholics, and the Three Self Movement for the Protestants. So if priests or pastors refuse to do this, they are simply being taken out of their churches. Churches are being shut down, in some cases bulldozed. These priests and pastors are being pressured. Some of them are going to prison. So this is really getting serious. 100 churches, Catholic churches, have been shut down since August in Pujo province alone. We're very concerned that this is going to have an enormous impact on the Chinese Catholic Church. And I'll just add one thing. If you want to get rid of a religious group, particularly in a country where the younger people have been almost aborted out of existence, what you do is say anyone under 18 can't go to church. And that's what the Chinese have done officially. So this is quite serious, and I'm concerned that the United States and other Western governments have not really taken it as seriously as they should.
Dr. Farr, we don't have much time left, but I would quickly like to ask you, what can be done to hold the Chinese government responsible for religious persecution?
Well, it's a good question. Ambassador Sam Brownback has done an excellent job of calling attention to what's going on. He's called it a war on faith. He's correct. What can be done is the president can incorporate this issue into his negotiations with the Chinese over a trade pact. There's no sign he's going to do this, but certainly I believe he should. Plus, I believe the United States should call a meeting of the UN Security Council. Of course, China is part of that, but it would show that we are really serious about what is a very serious situation.
Dr. Farr, thank you so much. Dr. Thomas Farr, president of the Religious Freedom Institute, thanks again for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Pope Francis meets the president of Argentina, Alberto Fernandez, at the Vatican. During their meeting in the Apostolic Palace, they address the economic financial crisis, fight against poverty, corruption, and drug trafficking in the country. Pope Francis also emphasized the importance of protecting life from the moment of conception. The First Lady of Argentina joined her husband to meet the Pope and exchange gifts. Pope Francis tells the elderly they are also the present and the future of the Church.
Sono loro l'anello indispensabile per educare la fede ai piccoli e ai giovani.
The Holy Father spoke today to participants of the first International Congress on Pastoral Care of the Elderly. He said they are the link in educating children and young people in the faith. The Vatican Office for Laity, Family, and Life hosted over 500 experts and pastoral workers from 60 countries to discuss the responsibility towards grandparents and their vocation in the Church. Vittorio Scelzo works in the Vatican's Office for the Elderly and Children and joins us now from Rome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me today. Thank you.
Well, this is the first time the Holy See has organized an event of this kind. How was the outcome?
Well, we are really satisfied by the outcome of the meeting. We had here almost 600 people coming from every corner of the world, and all of them are engaged in pastoral service with elderly people. We had Episcopal conferences, association, religious congregation, and people engaged. I mean, it was really something that we didn't expect. We were waiting 100 or 200 people, and there were almost 600. It means that we were touching something important, something relevant that is relevant for the future of the Church.
I know your office is a recent addition to the Vatican. How do you specifically help the Church to care for the elderly and for children?
Well, I mean, you know that the Vatican cannot be engaged in direct pastoral service. I mean, this is a task for the Episcopal conferences, the diocese, and the movement, and everybody. But we can put on the table that there is a new issue in the Church, which is the pastoral care for the elderly. Pope Francis is insisting so much in defending the elderly from the culture of throwaway culture. I mean, we cannot accept people abandoned in institution. We should tell something very clear against institutionalization of the elderly. Every churchgoer should go and visit an elderly. Why shouldn't we have an elderly as a friend? Why shouldn't we go to visit the elderly every Sunday after Mass? This is something that can be very useful for the future of the church and for the elderly themselves.
What do you think people can do in addition to reach out to the elderly, like you mentioned?
Well, I mean, first of all, keep your grandfather and grandmother at home, not abandon them. We are defending the family. We are defending the family, the sacred value of the family. In our family, there are husband, wives, grandfather and grandmother, and children, of course. In the family, there are grandparents. And this is something that we have to consider. Then we have to tell to the elderly that they should not think that when the work finish, their life of disciple ends. There is a vocation for the elderly. The Pope is insisting that the elderly, he told today that they are the future of the church, not the past. There is a vocation. When you talk about vocation, you talk about the future. There is a hope that is announced for the elderly. They are called to move themselves, to outreach, to go out of the church, to visit our other elderly, and to pray. There is nobody is so fragile that cannot pray. Prayer is a vocation for all the elderly.
Vittorio, thank you so much for joining us. Vittorio Scelzo, Vatican Office for the Elderly and Children. Thank you.
Thank you to you and for all who are listening. Thank you.
Coming up, after several decades, Britain is no longer part of the European Union. We examine what's next. After a half a century, Great Britain is no longer a member of the European Union. Brexit, as it's known, became official tonight. Now they have until the end of the year to come up with a trade treaty. The British people voted to leave 3.5 years ago, but it was by a narrow margin, and the citizens remain divided over whether Brexit is good or bad. European lawmakers say the UK will regret leaving the bloc, but in a nationally televised address, Prime Minister Boris Johnson says Brexit is not an end, but a beginning. He calls it a moment of real national renewal. Joining us now to discuss Brexit is Kevin Turley. He is UK correspondent for EWTN's National Catholic Register. Kevin, welcome back to the show. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Tracy.
Kevin, remind us again why Britain wanted to leave the European Union.
Well, Tracy, that's a really interesting question, but I'm afraid it's the sort of question that will keep academics occupied or preoccupied for the next 100 years. There's no easy answer. There were complex reasons. Some people have tried to make it out that it was simply about immigration or it was about economic decline. However, different regions voted for different reasons, and I think it's simple to say that perhaps the whole concept of what a European Union was becoming anathema to many in the United Kingdom.
Well, Scotland's also included in Brexit, but its lawmakers wanted to remain in the EU. There have been strong arguments made by both sides. Can we talk about that?
Yes, I mean, the United Kingdom is made up of 4 nations, England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. England and Wales majority votes for Brexit. Scotland and Northern Ireland majority votes to remain within the European Union. In fact, Scots voted by 63% to remain within the European Union. This has to be viewed against a backdrop of rising Scottish nationalism. There was a referendum in 2014 which was supposed to decide the issue of Scottish independence for a generation. It hasn't done that. What we have instead is a resurgent nationalism. In the last election, the last general election, the Scottish Nationalists won 48 of 59 seats in Scotland. They are the predominant political force. And Brexit, if I may say, is a gift to them because it basically allows them to say that London is imposing its will upon the Scots and that they need to go independent.
Well, the UK formally leaves today, but it seems there are still negotiations to be had. What still needs to be hammered out, and how long do you think that will take?
Well, as you said at the start, Boris Johnson said this is just the end of the beginning. That is the understatement. Brexit actually starts now. The negotiations, the hard work of negotiation, the economic, political and social withdrawal of the United Kingdom from the European starts tomorrow. They have 11 months, that's the deadline given by Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, of the United Kingdom to sort out a free trade agreement with the remaining 27 members of the European Union. That is a big ask.
Kevin, can we talk about the economic impact of Brexit?
Yes, again, this is something which both sides have made cases that it will be an economic disaster. For example, the Remain side said that why would you want to leave on preferential terms that we have at the moment, the European Union, which has a market of 500 million people? What the Leave side have said is we need to get out of the European Union because it is failing economically and politically, and we need to get out and make trade agreements with countries like China, the United States, Brazil, emerging markets across the world, that the European Union as a kind of project is failed not just politically, but also economically. What the impact on the British economy will be, nobody quite knows. It may free it up in a way that it certainly needs to be freed up. Everybody has agreed that the British economy needs a reboot, and this may be the thing that it needs. However, on the downside, what you have now is instead of the British being part of a very strong economic trading group to being on its own, instead of being part of 500 million, you now have 65 million people trying to make agreements with countries around the world. It's a slightly different negotiation in those circumstances.
Well, Kevin, we appreciate your insight. Kevin Turley, UK correspondent for EWTN's National Catholic Register. Thank you.
Thank you.
Up next, a look at the life of St. Thomas Aquinas as depicted in art. And a player in this Sunday's Super Bowl tells us about faith and football.
Earlier this week, we celebrated the feast day of St. Thomas Aquinas, the 13th century theologian who showed that the Catholic faith is in harmony with philosophy and all other branches of knowledge. Here to help us explore the life of St. Thomas Aquinas through art is Jem Sullivan. She is the author of The Beauty of Faith. Jem, welcome back. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Tracy.
First off, let's start talking about St. Thomas Aquinas and his life.
Yes, St. Thomas Aquinas is a Dominican friar who lived in the 13th century and is considered one of the most influential theologians of the Church. The Church, in fact, gives him many special titles. He's Doctor of the Church, he's an angelic doctor, he's a Doctor of Humanity. Why these special titles? Because St. Thomas brought faith and reason together in a unique synthesis, in a way that few theologians had done before or after him. St. Thomas spent long hours in prayer and study, contemplating the Word of God, and then sharing the fruits of his contemplation in his theological writings. His most well-known work is the Summa Theologiae. He also wrote commentaries on Scripture, which are treasures of wisdom and insight into who God is and who we are in relationship to God.
Yeah, and you brought this beautiful piece of art with you. Please explain it to us. It's from the National Gallery of Art.
Yes, so this is a visual homily on St. Thomas's life, a scene from St. Thomas's life, and it gives us a sense of the importance of prayer in his life. There's a story told of St. Thomas that he was praying before the crucifix, and he heard the Lord say to him, "Thomas, you have written so well of me, what will your reward be?" And St. Thomas says in reply, "Lord, nothing but you. Nothing but you. You are my reward." And so we see that St. Thomas kneeling before the crucifix in this beautiful etching from the National Gallery, along with two other saints. There's St. Mary Magdalene at the foot of the cross, and another Dominican friar, St. Albert the Great, who was the great teacher of Thomas Aquinas.
And Jem, in your opinion, what's the takeaway from this image?
You know, I think this image reminds us of the importance of prayer in the Christian life. We see St. Thomas here. He was gifted with a great intellect, but his intellectual work was rooted, grounded in prayer. So I think if we are looking to understand the Scriptures, if we're looking to know the mysteries of faith, we too must be rooted in prayer, as St. Thomas was. And we see this conversation with God is when we hear over and over again the invitation to friendship with God.
And as we honor St. Thomas Aquinas this week, what are the lessons there for us as Catholics to incorporate into our daily lives?
I think, you know, it's really this centrality of prayer and just contemplating Jesus on the cross, as St. Thomas does in this beautiful etching, and that prayer is, in fact, the foundation, the root of all that we do. Everything that we do really flows from this communion, this conversation that we have with God.
Yeah, Jem, thank you so much. Thank you for coming and bringing this beautiful painting with us and sharing it with us. We thank you again. Jem Sullivan, author of The Beauty of Faith. Thank you.
Thank you.
And finally tonight, the Super Bowl is this Sunday between the Kansas City Chiefs and the San Francisco 49ers. And one player told EWTN correspondent Colin Flynn last year about football and his Catholic faith.
Harrison Butker is a kicker for the Kansas City Chiefs. A star player, he is to many living the dream. But growing up, Harrison wasn't always happy in himself.
I don't know, you just play up a different person for different crowds, I guess. It's like certain Harrison for the football team, certain Harrison for the cameras, certain Harrison for your parents and families, certain guy for the weekends. You know, it's just like you're almost this fragmented person. I was just going through the motions. It was this emptiness, you know. I liked football, but there was nothing I was really like passionate about.
On his college football team was a man called Grant, who was a strong Catholic, and he encouraged Harrison to go back to his faith.
The biggest leap of faith for me was finally going to the sacrament of confession. And then that really was like what changed me. When I left that confessional, the way I felt, that was really what made me feel different than what I'd been feeling before. I felt like I don't know, I felt like me. I felt like I was authentically Harrison, you know, in every area of my life.
Now, after training, Harrison changes, but not into what you'd expect. He puts on a cassock and serves at Latin Mass every week.
It's opened my eyes to the tradition of the faith, you know, with St. Augustine, with Thomas Aquinas, with all of these great saints, and then seeing that this Mass of the Roman Rite, the Latin Mass, has been the Mass for the past 1,500 years that all these great saints went to. They were saying the same Latin prayers. It's just very beautiful. You know, I feel very united.
Father Sean Tunick is the associate pastor at the parish St. Michael the Archangel in Leawood, which is close by. He celebrates a Latin Mass every Monday evening, and recently he and Harrison organised a solemn high Mass, the most extravagant form of Latin Mass that can be offered.
This just shows me that, especially our young people, they want something more than just the typical. They want something that is noble and beautiful, and particularly when our society is so up in the air about what's a solid foundation. Morals are changing. Our ideas of theology, philosophy are changing. This is the worship of God that lasted all the crises, the ups and downs of history for 1,500 years. That's something worthy.
Final big question, of course. You were just one win away from it last season, but this season, Super Bowl?
I think so, definitely.
Are you praying for it?
I'm not praying about that, no.
Why not? You should be praying for it.
I don't know. I pray for myself to be a good husband and father, I guess. That's number one.
Harrison, it was great meeting you, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Colin. Appreciate it.
In Kansas City, I'm Colin Flynn for EWTN News Nightly.
And this year he is in the Super Bowl, and we thank you for watching tonight. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Tracy Sable. We're back Monday with more news from a Catholic perspective. Good night and God bless.